Good evening. Today I bring you tales of the macabre, tales of murder, tales of unnatural inclinations in the hearts of men. I bring you the complete filmography of Alfred Hitchcock. Ranked from worst to best, I cover every film he made save his sole lost film. It is 53 films, and let's just get right to it. If you want to watch my complete thoughts, if you want to watch my thoughts on Alfred Hitchcock's journey from silent to sound, you can click on here. Otherwise, let's just get right down to it. Number 53 is The Pleasure Garden. This is Alfred Hitchcock's very first film. It is a silent film from 1925, and it's honestly not very good. I have heard that there is a restoration and re-edit of the film that exists that actually greatly improves, but I have been unable to see it. So I can only watch it in the 60-minute version that it's existed in for decades. And it's not very compelling. It is a 60-minute long feature film that is so overstuffed with character and story done in a silent style that it can't really settle on anything and convincingly deliver any part of its story. It's also hampered by the fact that there are character choices that just kind of make no sense. It's the story of a young dancer who decides that she's going to marry a man who obviously doesn't love her. And she's like really disappointed when he ends up not loving her. And he like runs off to Jamaica because he doesn't want to bring her with him because he has a girl there. And then she like runs to Jamaica and discovers, oh, he has a girl there, and there's like a fight over her honor or something. It's weird. But the first like act of it is really dominated by another character who is kind of this preternatural dancer who gets paid a whole lot of money to join the dancing troupe. And it's a confused mess of a film. It's just not terribly like convincing on any real level, and it's mostly just a curio as Hitchcock's first film, but it's really not worthy that much of discovery. Number 51 is Juno and the Paycock. This is Hitchcock's first full sound feature film. His first sound feature was Blackmail, which was only partially sound. This is the adaptation of an Irish play, and it's weirdly uncompelling. It is an obvious cash grab to try to take advantage of the new sound craze, and they just quickly filmed a play. And it's one of probably the least cinematic film that Hitchcock ever made. It was obviously made over the course of like a week or two, and there's very little for him to actually do in terms of his camera work, which just kind of drags the entire film down. That's not the only problem with it. I don't think the base play is actually very good. It's not terrible, it's fine. It's the story of an Irish family who is suddenly presented with the idea that they're going to get a large inheritance, and they end up immediately becoming spendthrifts before they even get the inheritance. And then they blame the one guy who kind of didn't go out and buy a bunch of furniture for their entire downfall afterwards. And it doesn't really work. It's a very odd set of events, and it does not come together. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it really is just kind of a dull, curious affair, and Hitchcock had nothing to really do, and it's kind of bland. Number 51 is Topaz. Now this is very late stage Hitchcock, and honestly, Hitchcock should have been beyond making a movie this bad. It's not worthless. He very much has some very beautiful images, and he has a very strong command of sequences, but the problem is none of the sequences actually tie together. There's some behind the scenes drama. Apparently this was a director for hire job. It was contractual on his part. He had to make this movie even if he didn't care about it. And they were writing scenes right before they filmed them. And so, his writer for Vertigo was just delivering scenes immediately before filming. And nothing actually ends up tying together. The first 30 minutes is an extended cat and mouse sequence involving characters we pretty much never see again. The middle hour deals with a particular antagonist played by John Vernon, and then he's completely forgotten, and like the last 40 minutes is just suddenly dealing with with French spies. The Cuban menace was the middle, the French spies is the end, and nothing really ties together particularly well. Again, there are some very beautiful images in here. There's one particular image of a woman in a purple dress kind of falling to the floor that gets played a lot in terms of like Hitchcock was a great filmmaker montages. And it's beautiful, but it's just this disconnected moment in the middle of a bunch of stuff that just doesn't really connect. Again, he's still a really good filmmaker. It's just nothing actually ties together. It's ultimately a base scripting issue, and it doesn't come together at all. I think Quentin Tarantino kind of points to this as emblematic of, the Francois Truffaut conversation going to Hitchcock's head, where it's supposed to be arty all of a sudden. And I don't entirely see that. I see some of it. But mostly this just feels like a director who just doesn't want to make a movie and kind of has to. And it's just like, let's just get through the day and we'll move on to something else afterwards. Number 50 is The Paradine Case. This was the final film that Alfred Hitchcock made for David O. Selznick, and we move from one contracted movie to another contracted movie in terms of the rankings. This is a film where it feels like Hitchcock just couldn't care. There are a lot of stories of Hitchcock being bored on set because he pre-planned so much that just the execution of the film was kind of dull to him, and he didn't really have an interest in actors. But it's when it happens on movies like this that just don't really work that it kind of becomes more prominent. It's the story of Gregory Peck playing a lawyer who has to defend a beautiful woman accused of murdering her husband. And apparently the original cut of the film was about 3 hours long. The final cut is under 2. And that missing hour probably was important. Because the film essentially falls into 2 chunks. The first hour or something is Gregory Peck kind of going around discovering the personalities of the case, but none of the actual details of the case. And there's this subplot that doesn't really go anywhere about where his wife is jealous of him defending this beautiful woman. And Gregory Peck is supposed to be this brilliant lawyer, so he should have been able to defend someone along these lines, a beautiful woman at some point in his career, and his wife not become like weird about it. And then this first half is just like not interesting because we're not going into any of the details of what actually happened. We're leaving that for later. It's just these cloudy personalities that don't actually kind of connect. They don't actually mean much of anything. And then we get to the second half, which is better, but it's just very basic courtroom stuff. And it's really kind of buoyed by the presence of Charles Laughton, who's just, has fun. And to kind of make matters worse, Gregory Peck's entire persona as this brilliant lawyer is really undermined by the very fact that he tries something really stupid as his central strategy in the entire thing. Instead of just casting reasonable doubt on his client, he tries to cast positive doubt on someone else, which is not the job of a lawyer. It's very movie stuff, but it doesn't work. It's really stupid, and it kind of bites him. And it's like, this is a brilliant lawyer who did something that was obviously really stupid. So it's like, but again, Hitchcock, very good filmmaker at this point. He's doing everything he can to kind of make things look good, but ultimately he's just, I think the missing hour probably affected things. I don't know what it would be, that missing hour, but I'm pretty sure it would have made the film better. And just ultimately this is kind of like a wet fart of a film that just doesn't connect and doesn't really engage. It's not very good. Number 49 is Champagne. This is one of Alfred Hitchcock's silent films, and it's very, very weird. It is the story of a girl, she doesn't have a character name, who is the daughter of a wealthy man, and she loves a man that her father disapproves of. And this woman is kind of insane. The movie starts with her flying a plane out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to crash it near a ship that her beau is on. And, she gets picked up and, he loves her and all that fun stuff. Where this movie gets really weird is in the fact that her father pretends to lose all of his money, and she becomes so desperate at trying to maintain a living that she goes to work at a nightclub and essentially ends up prostituting herself. And I don't think the film realizes that it's really messed up. I really don't think it, because it's just kind of treated lightly. The movie is ostensibly a comedy, and there are funny bits here and there, but ultimately it's really weighed down by the fact that, holy crap, this woman is going through absolute hell. It's a weird film, and I don't think any of it really connects. You know, we end up with a happy ending. Some of Hitchcock's most impressive like montage stuff is in here. There are party sequences that are kind of amazing to look at. Acting is actually pretty good, but ultimately this is a movie kind of weighed down by the implications of its own story that it refuses to engage in. It's a very weird little movie, and I don't like it. Number 48 is The Ring. This is Alfred Hitchcock's third surviving feature film, so it's obviously silent. It's the story of a pair of boxers who, kind of end up dueling over a woman. It's almost a Howard Hawks movie in that way. It's not a good film. It's weirdly dull and flat for most of the runtime. Hitchcock just kind of, this was made immediately after The Lodger, which is kind of a vibrant, beautiful film to look at. And this film just kind of feels weirdly flat for very long stretches. But, the underlying story is fine. It functions. It's just, it's two men, one a professional boxer, the other kind of a carnival boxer who decides to try to make it as a professional boxer, fighting over the same woman. And there are actual individual sequences that are actually kind of wonderful to look at, and it's really just two of them. One of them goes on a drunken bender kind of early, and it's just marvelous to watch. The second is the big fight between them at the end, which is just kind of really dynamic and really interesting. You have to think this is well before the likes of something like Raging Bull or Rocky kind of established the modern cinematic language of the boxing ring. But here it's actually just really well developed already. Hitchcock kind of really knew what he was doing within an individual sequence. However, the film overall is just, it's not as engaging as it probably should be, and it ends up kind of a minor curio at the beginning of Hitchcock's career. But it's like, I wouldn't go so far as to call it bad. It's kind of okay. It's there. Number 47 is Spellbound. Now, I have a very long history of hating psychoanalysis in drama. It always feels incredibly artificial, and I really don't think Hitchcock could pull it off. He kind of made it central to plot mechanics in a couple of films, and Spellbound is the first one in this list. I don't think it works at all. It stars Gregory Peck as the new doctor to a mental hospital in rural New York, and he develops a relationship with Ingrid Bergman, who is an established doctor there. And, there's a murder, and it needs to be investigated. And was it Gregory Peck? And you know what? Everything about the investigation into Gregory Peck's memories feels fake. It feels like the creation of a screenwriter. It does not feel like actual, genuine exploration of memory. Now, the film seems to be mostly known because of a particular individual sequence. There is a dream sequence. It's roughly a minute long, and it was designed by Salvador Dali. Apparently, the actual original version of the dream sequence was about 20 minutes long, and we get about a minute of it. And the minute is interesting. It's an interesting kind of surrealistic take on memory. And I like it. It's interesting, but it's literally 1 minute long out of a 2-hour-long movie. It's not nearly enough. And so most of the film is really just this very artificial look into Gregory Peck's memory, and I don't buy it. And then like the last 15 minutes is like actual thriller stuff, which functions quite well. Throw on top of the fact I think that Gregory Peck is a plank of wood who couldn't act out his way out of a paper bag, and we have a film that just largely doesn't engage me. But at the same time, this is kind of at the height of Hitchcock's artistic powers, so he's doing everything he can to make it really, really good. looking at the very least. The psychoanalyst stuff was very important to him. He was very invested in it, so he tried his best. I just think it's a misstep. I don't really like the film. But you know, the last 15 minutes, it helps. Let's just put it that way. Overall, it's just, the movie's fine. It's fine despite all of my gripes with it, but ultimately the gripes exist, and I have watched this movie like twice, and I don't think I ever want to watch it again. Number 46 is Secret Agent. Now, this was made shortly after the 39 Steps, and it's a healthy step down. It really kind of feels like two movies in one, and the two movies clash rather horribly. It's the story of, you know, spycraft during World War I, where a spy is sent to a hotel in Germany to figure out what's going on. Who is this spy that he has to find? He brings along a fake wife named Elsa, and they end up finding the wrong man. And this like fun adventure story suddenly stops cold. Like hard stop cold, because finding the wrong man is a terrible moral quandary. And you know what? That could be this like great shock to take us into another direction where it's like, oh, you know, the spy game is actually really dangerous and has real moral implications. You know, it kind of taking us from a James Bond type thing into a John le Carre thing. It would be fine. Except the movie really wants to keep on with the spy adventure stuff. And so we have this, you know, facing of like moral implications, and then none of it matters. We just keep going on with the spy stuff. Throw in the fact that like Elsa is kind of a terrible character. She just kind of disappears for long stretches. Whenever she is around, she actually isn't very like useful at all in terms of like the plot, in terms of helping the plot move along. And it's just, it's a frustrating film. It really feels like it's built from a couple different stories that don't actually mesh. There are some interesting performances. Peter Lorre is kind of a central performance, and he's kind of wonderful to watch. But otherwise, this is just kind of a mediocre little entry in Hitchcock's late British period that just doesn't engage nearly as well as it should, because it can't really commit to its own ideas. Number 45 is Mary. This is the German version of the English language movie Murder. And I just have to, you know, I'll talk a bit more about the actual story of the thing when I get to Murder. But Mary is more of a curio for how the studios were kind of dealing with early sound obstacles. You know, we have a movie that we think will play well in a particular country, but we don't know how to actually deliver it to that country who don't speak English. And so Alfred Hitchcock says, okay, well, I speak German, so we'll just make the German version of this at the same time. You know, so he would film scenes with his English cast, he would kick them out, and then he would bring in his German cast, and then they would film the same scenes. So it literally is exactly the same movie, except with a different cast and with told in German. And all of my problems with Murder are present here because it's literally the exact same script. It's not even like the dual versions of Dracula, where a different director came in and said, oh, I can do it slightly different, maybe slightly better. This is literally just Hitchcock repeating himself. And it's curious more as a historical example of what kind of, you know, film was doing at the time, but ultimately it's if you want to watch the movie as a movie, you'll watch Murder. Speaking of which, number 44 is Murder. So obviously the English language version of Mary. This is the story of an actress who is accused of murder. And she's accused of murder of one of her fellows in the acting troupe. And my real problem with the film is that like the first hour is a trudging bore. It is kind of this monomaniacal look at one view of how the murder could have happened, which places the blame fully on her. And it lasts for a solid hour. And it only really starts coming apart at the hour mark when one of the jurors at the trial decides, hey, there's an unanswered question that needs answering about who might have also been in the room. And then he takes a couple of people from the acting troupe after the trial, after the woman has been declared guilty, He goes and he starts his own investigation. I'm not opposed to the idea of police missing things, especially when, evidence seems to be so, obvious on its face. So that's not really my problem. It's just, it takes forever to get there. We should have reached that point by like minute 10 to 15, not minute 60. And that's really what it is. And it's really frustrating. After that, though, it just becomes kind of the typical wrong man, I'm going to investigate things on my own sort of movie that Hitchcock was really known for. And you know what? It actually ends up working quite well. It's just, we have to get through that long first hour to actually get there. And so, murder ends much better than it begins, but we just have to get through that beginning first. Number 43 is Waltzes from Vienna. Did you know that Alfred Hitchcock made a light comedic musical produced by Tom Arnold? Obviously not that Tom Arnold. But it's really kind of this very light attempt at history. It's absolutely awful history, just to kind of show us what Johann Strauss went through in order to write the beautiful Blue Danube. And it's all complete historical nonsense. It really is ultimately the story of a young man who is under his father. His father wants him to follow his more normal ways. The young Strauss wants to go off on his own to create something new, which would be the beautiful Blue Danube. And he's also caught between the Countess, who believes in his new direction, and Resi, his engaged. And none of the dramatics actually seem to matter that much. It's rather simple and easy to follow through. A lot of this could just be fixed by simple conversations, but so it ends up having this very sitcom-y feel. But you know what? It's amusing as it goes. You take individual moments, like the moment that the beautiful Blue Danube actually comes to the young Johann Strauss, and he's working in a bakery, and like the different sounds in the bakery kind of are coming together to create the harmony of the beautiful Blue Danube. And it's like, well, that's not how composition works, but in a movie, in a light comedic, hardly historical movie about the creation of a piece of music, it kind of works. It's kind of cute. The actual dramatics kind of escalate with trying to get to a performance on time and trying to like cover up the Countess's presence in his apartment, and it's all light and fluffy, and it's lightly amusing, but ultimately absolutely no more than that. It's helped by the fact that it's only 75 minutes long, and so it's not good, but it's sort of okay. Number 42 is Number 17. This is early sound stuff from Hitchcock, and it is Hitchcock kind of getting his feet back under him. He's entering playful territory again, and it needed more. It's fairly close to good, but ultimately the movie kind of falters because it is so agonizingly short. It's only 65 minutes long. It has like a dozen characters. There is so much kind of misdirection about who is who and what their motives are, that it just becomes this kind of confusing mess, especially in the middle, where its stage-bound roots are kind of obvious, and it's hard to kind of understand what is actually going on. The movie starts fairly strong with like some wonderful visual stuff, and its last like 15, 20 minutes is like this extended chase, which is actually really good. It's just that middle part. It's so like, I don't understand what people are trying to get out of it, what the individual characters are trying to get out of it, and it really kind of undermines everything. If this movie were like 20 to 30 minutes longer, if we had that extra time with these characters in order to kind of like settle in with maybe a couple of them and who they actually really are, so we can have some sort of emotional grounding through all of the kind of like the double crosses and stuff, it would handle things better. But ultimately, the movie is frustrating. I want to like it more than I do. Its opening and closing are surprisingly strong, but ultimately that middle section just frustrates me. Number 41 is Rich and Strange. This is another one of Hitchcock's early sound films, and it's really just a character drama. And the middle section, roughly about 40 minutes, is where the film kind of shines, where it really is just this well created and performed and written drama about two young people who have just married, who are on a tram steamer to do a tour of the world, and who grow apart. It's surprisingly like well done. It's, you know, the young man ends up seasick and stuck in his room for a few days, so the young woman ends up meeting an older man on deck and they just develop a rapport. When the young man gets out and discovers that his wife is spending all this time with this older man, he ends up discovering that this princess has a weird attraction to him, so he ends up connecting with her. And so they end up kind of growing apart over time. And it's surprisingly well done. But my problem really is the opening, which is kind of this like very quick introduction of a bunch of characters, which I just don't think works particularly well, and the ending. The ending is, it's not the entire ending. Most of the ending is, you know, the tram steamer kind of sinks and then they end up on a Chinese fishing vessel and they have to kind of reconnect. Just like the very like stinger of an ending is an attempt at comedy that I feel like rubs me wrong. And that kind of extends to the rest of my issues with the film, which is the comedy. The comedy throughout feels forced and largely flat. Most of it is centered around a maid character who kind of just injects herself into scenes, and she's supposed to be laugh out loud hilarious, and I just found her not funny. So that kind of undermines things. So the beginning and the ending are just issues. The actual middle is really good, except for when the maid shows up. So it's an interesting film. I want to like it a bit more than I do, but ultimately it ends up an interesting, okay little movie in Hitchcock's early sound period. Number 40 is The Manxman. The Manxman is one of Hitchcock's late silent films, and it's an interesting example of an adaptation kind of going wrong. I don't hate the film by any measure, but it is all of the dramatic high points with none of the actual legwork in between to actually create, like, essentially characters and relationships. It's based on a novel. I assume the novel actually does all of that, but this silent adaptation really is just a series of kind of high emotional moments. And you know what? Despite my problems with the fact that, you know, relationships are never actually dramatized, you know, these relationships are extremely important, in particular between the two male leads who are described as lifelong friends, even though we never really see them be friendly, or between one of the male leads and the female lead who are described as having some sort of passionate affair, and we never see it. The actual high dramatic moments are really well done. So, you know, even though I feel like the adaptation kind of went completely wrong in the scripting stage, Hitchcock does everything he can to make the actual high moments, without the actual legwork in between, to make them as compelling as possible. And this is really helped by the lead female performance, which is really, really good. The male performances are less compelling, but you know, it's like the lead female performance is strikingly good. And the actual dramatics of the story make sense. It's just we don't have those moments in between that kind of build relationships. And just to take note of the ending is emblematic of what pre-Hays Code era movies could do. You know, there's infidelity, there is a bastard child, and you know, the actual resolution of things is not just good guys get good and bad guys get bad, you know, which the Hays Code would have demanded, you know, just a few years later. But ultimately, it's an embrace of moral complexity that actually interests me. But again, that legwork in between those big dramatic moments, which is completely absent, it really does not help the film. It needed to be there. It's not like the film is like 60 minutes long. It is like 100 minutes long, but like a solid 20 minutes more of just stuff to get it to a full 2 hours would probably have helped the film in no small measure. Number 39 is Easy Virtue. Now, this is something of a thematic sequel to one of Hitchcock's earlier silent films called Downhill. And It essentially just kind of gender swaps the thing. So in this one, it's about a girl who is unfairly accused of kind of moral impropriety, who has to try to move on from her life. And the first 20 minutes is the establishment of that suspicion around her moral impropriety, and it is some of the most fun that Hitchcock was in the silent era. It is just this kind of playful sense of editing as we watch a courtroom scene, but then we have flashbacks, and the flashbacks happen, through the use of like individual elements, like a picture. It's like we see a picture on the table, and then suddenly we're flashed back to the events that we're describing. It's very fun. It's like 20 minutes. It's really, really fun. And then after that, the main character, Larita, she decides, well, I can't recover my reputation, so she runs to the south of France, and the heir of an English fortune sees her and immediately falls in love with her. And he will not be dissuaded by his mother that there's something wrong with her. It's solid stuff. It's just, I love this woman, I don't care what you say. And then the finale feels off. So Larita realizes she's kind of cornered and trapped, and she just decides to kind of embrace her past in a way that no one can deny it. She like cuts off the hem of her dress to make it a kind of a flapper dress, just to kind of signal to everyone that she is, kind of this woman of loose reputation, shall we say, even if it's unearned. And then the film just kind of ends sappy, and I don't buy it. Hitchcock would later say in his interview with Truffaut that he kind of hated the ending, and I agree with him on this. I think it's an ending that doesn't actually kind of follow from what came before. And endings are important, and I think if you stumble the ending, it kind of affects a lot of things, and I think it does here. It's not enough to make the movie bad, but I think it's enough to pull it away from good. So it's actually a really interesting film. I don't think the ending follows. I don't think it quite fits, and I think that hurts the film overall. Number 38 is I Confess. So this is an interesting one. It is essentially just a character drama, but Hitchcock is so fully in his I have to film everything like a thriller that he films this like a thriller, and I think it actually clashes with the material. It's not the center of my complaints, but it's just kind of where I start when I start thinking of this film again. The other problem is that our central character, Father Logan, played by Montgomery Clift, is like weirdly passive. So it's the story of Father Logan, who hears a confession from a murderer, and he can't say anything because he heard it in confession, and he's a Catholic priest. So, he like holds this secret about who murdered the subject in the film, and he won't reveal it. So that's understandable. However, there is a second secret, and it's from his childhood friend Ruth. Before World War II, he and Ruth were promised to each other. During the war, they lost contact. Ruth ended up marrying another man, and they come back, and they, without realizing that she's married, I guess she didn't wear a wedding ring, they end up spending a very innocent night caught in the rain under a gazebo. This was made in the 40s, so there is absolutely no even indication of like anything like sexual impropriety. And he has to keep this deeply secret as well. If this movie had been made like 15 years earlier or 10 years later, we could have had that explicit, oh yeah, I definitely boned her moment, which would make more sense in kind of keeping that secret, but it's not actually here. There is absolutely no indication at all that anything bad happened. And so him keeping this secret in order to keep her honor makes literally no sense. And we end up with this potential contrast that would come up where if he had like kept the killer's secret because it was in the confessional, but he refused to keep Ruth's secret because there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, it would have made him a more interesting character. Instead, that uniformity of him just refusing to talk just makes him really passive in the face of everything that happens all around him. And so like what goes on around him is like interesting, and Hitchcock is really pushing his visuals here, kind of making it one of his most German expressionistic, obviously influenced films in a while. But ultimately, I find the central passivity of Logan to be like deeply uncompelling, and I end up very mixed on the film. I want to like it more, but ultimately the film is just frustrating. Number 37 is Marnie. Now I know some people really do consider Marnie to be some sort of late stage masterpiece, but I really don't think it quite works. Like a couple of other films, I really see this movie in halves. The first half I think works really, really well, and the second half I just kind of roll my eyes at. So it's the story of Marnie, played by Tippi Hedren, and she is kind of a low-level con artist. She gets to work in a place, and she kind of learns the ropes of everything, and then she steals everything from the safe, and then she leaves. The problem is she gets caught. She gets caught by Mark, who was, a client of one of her previous Marks, and, he ends up trapping her. And, he traps her into a marriage. He forces her to marry him. There's some on-the-nose stuff here where, he's talking about how he loves zoology, but he sees her as a wild animal, which is, again, kind of on the nose. But ultimately, I think this first hour actually works surprisingly well. And then we get to the second hour, and it's just pure psychotherapy. And as I said while talking about Spellbound, I don't buy psychotherapy in drama. And that's all this ends up being. Hitchcock absolutely loved psychotherapy, and he really tried to dramatize Freud's theories into some sort of cinematic form, and I just think he doesn't make it work. And it's ultimately because the central character of Marnie is scarred by a singular event from her childhood, and it completely explains her character, and just by confronting that, everything in her is fixed. I don't buy it at all. It's just, it doesn't feel real. It feels mechanical. It feels like the invention of a screenwriter. It doesn't feel human. And so we end up with this kind of final stage of events, which dominates the last hour. And I just it's beautifully filmed. There are a lot of strong performances, but ultimately Hitchcock is so obsessed with Freud that it ends up really kind of undermining everything. I don't buy it. And no, it doesn't feel real. So, I kind of love the first hour. The second hour is just not at all convincing, but it's really well executed. And ultimately I end up it almost works, but really it's just Hitchcock, man. Freud does not make good drama. Number 36 is Blackmail. Now this is really noteworthy because it's Alfred Hitchcock's first sound film, and it's actually Britain's first sound film. It had completely shot silently, and then the jazz singer blew up, and they kind of figured out sound well enough to film a handful of sequences. And the film is okay. It's really noteworthy for those sound sequences. On the one hand, we have boring conversations between characters. On the other hand, we have the knife scene, which is great. But the actual murder mystery stuff underneath is less compelling. It's the story of a young woman who is kind of flighty and not that dedicated to her man, who ends up going up to the room of a man who tries to rape her, and she kills him. The titular Blackmail doesn't actually appear until about minute 60 of this 85-minute long film. So it kind of takes forever to get there. And I find that a bit frustrating. And once we do get there, I think the morality of things feels off. So, the girl obviously, in my mind, had some level of justifiable homicide in the entire situation. I'm not an expert on British law in the 1920s, so maybe, there was nothing like that. But it's hard to believe that there wasn't. And so her being blackmailed into, well, we're going to reveal that you killed this guy, it ends up losing its edge because, she did have justification for it. Would she have been able to convince the police of it? That's another question, but it's never actually brought up by the film. And then, the film kind of sidesteps the entire moral quandary with its final resolution, which I find frustrating. However, that being said, this was really the height of Hitchcock in the silent era, especially in terms of visuals. Everything silent looks fantastic, absolutely fantastic. The actual drama functions well enough, but it's not great. And the actual sound stuff is interesting, including one absolutely fantastic sequence. So I'm kind of mixed on the film. I want to like it more than I do, but ultimately the film just, I think it needed a rewrite, let's be honest. Number 35 is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This is interesting because it literally is just Alfred Hitchcock as a director for hire. Carol Lombard, who stars in the film as the titular Mrs. Smith, hired him. She was, powerful until her death in, what was it, 1941. And she essentially bullied him on set, so not a huge surprise. I have a strong feeling that, a blonde woman who actually hired Hitchcock could bully him around instead of the other way around. But it's a lightly amusing little comedy. It's a story of the titular Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith is played by Lombard, and Mr. Smith is played by Robert Montgomery. And they have this interesting relationship where, they get into really intense fights, and they end up not being able to talk to each other for several days. And the way that manifests is that they end up just kind of in their shared apartment in separate rooms. Their record is 8 days, and the movie starts on day 3 of a particular fight, which has just ended. So we end up seeing them in love. And then they discover that their actual marriage is not real. They got married out west, but the entire thing ends up not having been real, and so they have to get remarried. But he doesn't propose fast enough, which sparks another fight. And it's light comedy stuff. She goes off and she starts seeing another man, and there's like really funny stuff with the other man, like steadily getting drunk over the course of a night because of a cold cure-all that she recommends him, which is just a bunch of liquor. And it's and then it actually ends with the couple, the titular Mr. and Mrs. Smith, kind of reconnecting in a cabin, which has certain echoes of It Happened One Night, but ultimately is just kind of a rediscovery of how the film started. And so it's light, it's frothy, it's fun. I enjoy it. It's very atypical Hitchcock because it's essentially not a Hitchcock movie; it's a Carol Lombard movie. But you know what? He manages to set well. So congratulations. It's pretty fun. Number 34 is Jamaica Inn. This is his first adaptation of a Daphne du Maurier novel, the other, of course, being Rebecca. And this one was surprisingly savaged at the time. I actually read through some of the contemporary reviews, and they kind of make sense. They largely deal with changes from the novel, Charles Laughton's performance, and essentially changes from the novel that kind of reveal things too early. And I don't entirely disagree with these things. Well, the changes from the novel stuff, I've never read the novel, but it's different from the novel has never convinced me. It's an unconvincing argument. It's an argument by authority, and I just don't buy it. Anyway, however, Charles Laughton's performance is probably too big for the role, and the reveal early of Charles Laughton as like the bad guy instead of keeping it secret for longer, it probably does end up undermining some of the tension and suspense later. However, that being said, this is really, surprisingly strong Hitchcock stuff from his late British period. It's the story of, thieves on the Cornish coast of England who, douse lights in order to get ships to crash, and then they loot them. And, just trying to kind of undo the criminal element going on. And it's surprisingly well done. It's obviously not the novel, just based on what I've read, but I think it actually works fairly well as kind of this gothic romantic adventure and suspense film. I find it entertaining, and despite the fact that Laughton probably is working too big for the role, he was kind of like dominating set and saying, I want a bigger role. Yeah, he's always fun to watch. In absolutely everything he's in, he's always fun to watch. And him being so central is honestly not a bad thing. So is it great Hitchcock? Is it a great adaptation of du Maurier's novel? I don't think so, but ultimately I find it to be a fun little adventure movie. And it's hard for me to not appreciate just a fun little adventure movie. Number 33 is Sabotage, another late-stage British picture. This is Alfred Hitchcock. His technical side ends up dominating the second half of the film, and it's really kind of wonderful, that second half. The first half, I find frustrating. So it's the story of Sylvia Sidney. She is the wife to a small theater owner, and the small theater owner ends up being, well, a saboteur. And we find out very early through the police character of Ted that yes, the husband is actually the saboteur. And so the first half of the film is the wife essentially very slowly playing catch up to things that we have already figured out. And it's just, that's, Hitchcock's entire thing was about, the audience knowing things that characters don't in order to establish tension. But I think in terms of this particular instance, where it's like a solid 40 to 60 minutes of just, we know that her husband is the bad guy, and she is like not actually in danger. It's like, it kind of undermines things. However, once she actually figures it out, the perspective shifts between Ted and her kind of fall away, and the movie ends up becoming hers entirely. And it's just this marvelous sequence of tension-filled events as she discovers the true horrible nature of her husband. And she gets trapped in their house, and she can't escape, and it's wonderful. It should also be noted that you probably have seen a clip of this movie. It is in Inglourious Basterds, the clip from the old movie where the guy on the bus says, "You can't bring that film on. It's flammable." It's from this movie, and it's kind of how the sabotage happens. But the film ends magnificently, but its first half is kind of frustrating. And so I think the overall effect is actually solidly good. I kind of wish that first half had been rewritten a bit. But otherwise, the film is actually really entertaining. Number 32 is Young and Innocent, another late-stage British picture from Hitchcock. This one is curious. It's weirdly genteel in ways that kind of surprised me. It's the story of Robert, who is accused of a murder. A body washes up on shore, and he is seen running away from the scene with the body's jacket and himself, and he's accused of murder. And he ends up in this little romance with the chief constable's daughter. And, he ends up kind of escaping from prison because it's small-town British life, and they end up just kind of together for an hour. And we completely forget the mystery, and it's just this genteel little romance between two young people. And it's really dominated by this necessity to be polite, and it's kind of wonderful. Like, she first sees him outside of the prison, convinced he's a murderer, but she won't actually turn him in because he pays for her gas. So it's like, oh, well, I can't do that because he paid for my gas. Is it believable? Probably not, but you know what? It's nice. And then there's like the best sequence in the entire film. She goes to her aunt's house where there's a birthday party, and neither of them can keep straight like his name or what he does, and like the aunt just kind of knows what's going on, but they can't actually leave until they politely excuse themselves, which is this wonderful source of tension in the middle of this genteel little comedy. It's actually quite endearing. And then the finale is like, oh yeah, there was a murder mystery to solve. Let's go solve that real quick. It's just, no one's actually been pursuing clues for like an hour. But it's like, all right, it's like fine. It's kind of shocking too, because there's a bit of blackface. You don't often see blackface in films, and it's suddenly there. It's because it was just kind of a thing in the 30s. But I really kind of love that hour where it's just this genteel little comedy with like murder as kind of a background. Everything else around it is fine, but ultimately it's like I really gravitate towards that middle hour, which is just kind of wonderful. Number 31 is Foreign Correspondent. Now this is an interesting one. David O. Selznick loaned out Hitchcock to another producer who wanted to make an up-to-the-date film on the European situation in 1940. And you know what? It's hard to do in a movie. So some of my problems have to deal with that. But ultimately, the issue stems from the fact that our central relationship, our central romance is kind of awful. Joel McCrea plays a journalist who is kind of caught in, a murder mystery. And the relationship he develops with Lorraine Day is just kind of flaccid, and I don't buy it. But the actual mechanics of the actual mystery of the actual individual sequences are kind of wonderful. There's the stuff in, the Dutch countryside and the windmill, which is just wonderful to watch. The final plane crash is actually really, really well done. There's a murder early that's just fantastic to watch. But then you get to the actual like MacGuffin, and the details of the MacGuffin never actually matter. It's like the best of the MacGuffins in all of Hitchcock's career is in North by Northwest, where it's just like, it's, oh, well, let's just say it has something to do with secrets. You know, it's like, it's so undefined. But here we get the definition and it's outright silly. It is two ambassadors have agreed on a secret clause that they have only memorized. How are kings or, you know, presidents supposed to honor something like that? It's ridiculous. However, the movie really does kind of live and breathe by its individual sequences, and those sequences are amazing. They're like genuinely just Hitchcock kind of at the height of his power. It's just like the connecting tissue just is not as convincing as I want it to be. But once we actually get to those individual sequences, it's just, the movie is wildly entertaining. I just kind of wish the actual connective tissue was better. Number 30 is Stage Fright. This is a murder mystery with like a healthy twist that happens later. And I kind of spoiled it for myself when I watched it for the first time. And I recommend you just kind of go in clean. So I'm going to talk about this as generically as I can in case you haven't seen it. It's the story of a man who decides to clean up a murder for another woman. They're both actors. And the woman who loves the man who decides to help anyway, but then just tries to kind of like create a series of trails to implicate someone else. Create a trail of clues to implicate someone else. And I really like it. It's this fun little mystery that gets to play out over the course of 100 minutes. There are some weird things that go on. A lot of it has to deal with Jane Wyman. Jane Wyman was, you know, an actress, and she was very self-conscious about appearing on screen next to Marlene Dietrich, and Marlene Dietrich getting the glamorous role, while Jane Wyman had to play like the mousier role. And so there's a point where she decides to dress up as a maid, and there's even dialogue about her putting on makeup and stuff. And she looks no different. So it's like she was just too obsessed with being beautiful on the same screen with Marlene Dietrich, so that when she makes this transformation, it's really just a costume change. There's no actual transformation. But it's ultimately this kind of fun little mystery. It has weird moments that you're like, how is this going to connect? But then things just kind of play out surprisingly well. Alistair Sim is probably the height of the movie's acting side of things. He plays Jane Wyman's father, and he is kind of wonderful. He's always a wonderful actor. You know, he is in the most beloved version of A Christmas Carol for a reason. And it is a fun movie. Just don't spoil it. I'm very often just saying it's like movies that don't work spoiled don't work. This is like the exception. Just don't spoil it, and I think you'll actually have a better time with it than I did, because I spoiled it and I kind of ruined it a bit. But ultimately, it's good. Number 29 is Family Plot. I often use this as an example of a final film that just kind of exemplifies everything that a filmmaker did right and was kind of obsessed with in one final nice package. It's never going to be his best film, but it's going to be a nice film for him to go out on. This is in contrast to something like Billy Wilder, who went out with Buddy Buddy, which is an embarrassment in his worst film. So Family Plot is like a weirdly fun movie, especially in its like last half hour or so. It's about a dueling set of pairs of criminals. One is are kind of small-time crooks who get people to pay them diamonds for kidnapping. The other are like small-time fraudsters. And the movie spends like a solid amount of time establishing all four characters, as well as their particular mark, who ends up having a connection to one of them. And what's kind of interesting is, you know, the film ends up having a very clear preference for, you know, which of the two groups are actually supposed to be sympathetic. And watching that develop over time is actually surprisingly entertaining, especially once all four people end up connecting about like an hour in, and all of their conflicting goals and motivations, which are all centered around like the same mark, end up just kind of exploding. And it's very fun stuff. It's just, the performances are just kind of exactly what they need to be. Bruce Dern ends up, just kind of like a goofball and, who has like no idea what's going on, and it surprisingly works quite well. And the film is just, it's a light way for Hitchcock to go out. He could have gone out far, far worse. And it's a minor little thing, but ultimately, I'd rather him go out on a minor thing than a terrible thing. So that's that. Number 28 is Torn Curtain. Another late stage Hitchcock. This is the story of Paul Newman, who plays an American scientist who decides to defect to the Soviet Union, and the woman who is attracted to him, played by Julie Andrews, who decides to scold him for it. It's actually a surprisingly fun little cat and mouse game with an effort to kind of keep things surprisingly grounded in reality for a long stretch. There is an extended murder sequence about 30 minutes in, which is just about how hard it is to kill a man. It's Hitchcock just trying to play with the idea of like, oh, people die so easily in movies, but they're trying to kill a guy and they have to kill him like 10 different ways before he finally expires. And so there's like double dealing going on. They end up having to escape. Paul Newman and Julie Andrews are like kind of wonderful together. Apparently Hitchcock hated working with Paul Newman, but I really think Newman comes off really, really well in the film. Where the film doesn't work as well, I think, is in the ending. There's an escape out of Germany, out of East Germany, towards Sweden, and I think it's just more broadly comic in a way that doesn't really work and doesn't really fit with the rest of the film. It's not as entertaining as I think it should be. There's also kind of a wonderful late moment where a countess is begging them for sponsorship to become an American citizen, which is surprisingly heartbreaking, but kind of doesn't mean anything to the rest of the movie. It's just kind of this one isolated bit towards the end, essentially its own little short film. I kind of wish it actually affected things a bit more. But ultimately, it's an entertaining little film. It's got strong tension-based sequences, strong sequences of suspense, and I think Hitchcock comes off quite well at the end of it. Number 27 is The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake. I prefer the original. The remake is good. It's solidly good. It actually does a handful of things better. Hitchcock was a much more practiced hand at the craft of filmmaking, and so individual sequences kind of outshine the original in some certain ways. But I do feel like it's held back in a couple little ways. So it's the story of Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day, who play Americans whose son Hank is kidnapped when they're visiting Marrakesh. And they end up having to kind of travel around trying to figure out what happened to their son. And it's wrong man stuff. They go to London. They're trying to like figure out what this church has to do with anything. All that fun stuff. My problem is that some of the changes from the original, I just don't think are quite as effective. So the central change is, I mean, there are a lot of changes, but, and a lot of them don't mind me. Like changing the setting from Switzerland in the beginning to Marrakesh in the beginning of the remake doesn't bother me. But changing things like the Albert Hall sequence, which is so singular in the original and works so incredibly well, is replaced by, Doris Day singing Que Sera in a consulate, and it doesn't have the same kind of overall cinema effect. It's a bit more grounded in ways that I kind of don't expect from Hitchcock within this type of film. This type of film was in reaction to the last few years of his career, where in the late 40s and early 50s, Hitchcock had been really trying to experiment and push things in different directions. So, you have things like Rope, his one-take film. It's not even purported to be. There are several very obvious, like, actual cuts. Anyway, or in his previous film, which was The Trouble with Harry, which is kind of a light, dark comedy. And this is just a return to wrong man thriller stuff. And yeah, it works. I think it works quite well, but I really just feel like kind of the rougher edges of the original are just more entertaining overall. That being said, it is a solidly good film. It's hard to talk about it for me and not talk about the original because I prefer the original, but this one is solidly good. Number 26 is The Skin Game. This is very early sound stuff from Hitchcock, and it's based on a play. And it's the story of the Hillcrest and the Hornblower family who end up at war because the Hornblower patriarch backed out on a promise to the Hillcrest family. The Hornblowers are landowners, the Hillcrest are tenants, and the Hornblowers kick the Hillcrest out of the land in order to build a factory. And just the bitter war that erupts between them is wonderfully compelling. There's an auction for another piece of land called the Century, which is like wonderfully compelling. This is Hitchcock really getting his feet under him again after the advent of sound. Kind of embracing montage, and the actual like dramatics of it kind of like turn characters completely on their heads as the evil patriarch of the Hornblower family is willing to kind of unburden himself of everything in order to protect a daughter-in-law, while the Hillcrest matriarch is willing to burn everything down just for her vengeance. And it's just this wonderfully compelling dramatic angle. He can't quite completely get outside the set-bound nature of the actual film, but it is just this solidly good look at just a piece of drama. The main characters are reprising their roles from the stage, and they kind of own the roles very well. And ultimately, the film is just kind of a lost little treasure. It's solidly good stuff, and I really, it was a wonderful surprise. Number 25 is Lifeboat. Now, Hitchcock was a perennial experimenter, and this is one of his most obvious experiments. It is filming everything on a single set, and this set is a lifeboat in a water tank. And it's surprisingly a fun little film. My issue with it is that it feels like a series of stories instead of one story. So it's an ensemble piece about like half a dozen people who are on this lifeboat, and they're all going through their little things. So like the little romance that develops between a couple characters has nothing to do with like Gus, who's losing his foot, and it's just, they kind of feel like separate little dramas instead of all kind of coalescing together into one singular drama. It's my minor complaint with it. Overall, though, the film is like weirdly effective at just delivering all of these little dramas as they play out. And Hitchcock is wonderfully able to just make the film look interesting from beginning to end. It's like 100 minutes set on essentially one little set, and it's just it never looks visually boring. He was always just trying to find new ways to film things, and he was able to do it quite well. So the cast is anchored by Tallulah Bankhead, and she is, a Spitfire who just doesn't care about anything, and that's just who she was. So she's essentially just playing herself, and she's fun to watch, and the cast is all very good, including Bankhead, and Hitchcock is able to keep things interesting. His cameo, which he does frequently, is quite funny, but it's just I kind of wish it was one movie instead of a bunch of little movies, but that's a fairly minor complaint because the actual movie that it is fairly solid. Number 24 is Frenzy. What if I told you that Brian De Palma made this movie? Would it be a huge surprise? This kind of feels like a transition point between Hitchcock as he was and Brian De Palma as he would be. Of course, Brian De Palma had absolutely nothing to do with this movie. It's like, you follow this up with something like Sisters, and it's like, oh, that's not a huge jump. So Hitchcock had been facing career troubles in America for a while, and he ended up retreating to England to make Frenzy. England was a little less determined to hide things from audiences, explicit things, essentially because of, you look at like Hammer films, it's like, they'd been showing, gore and nudity for a while. And so Hitchcock runs to England, kind of films in his old neighborhood, and he makes his most explicit film. It's of course, the film about a murderer, about a man who is accused of murder and did not do it. And the movie is like weirdly fun. My issues with it largely deal with the fact that both the wrongly accused man and the accused man and the actual murderer kind of have the same amount of screen time, and I think it undermines creating them as like actual characters. The wrongly accused man is named Dick, and he kind of feels like a generic Hitchcock protagonist. He doesn't feel like an actual character. However, there's a lot of really fun stuff. The probably central sequence that everyone kind of remembers it for is that the killer kills a woman and then tries to hide her in a truck bed full of potatoes, and he ends up having to travel with her because things go wrong and things kind of continue to go wrong as he tries to fix things. And it's like, it's really blackly comic, and I really like it. The other thing is there's an inspector character who, you know, has these long scenes of exposition, but they're some of the most fun scenes of exposition I've seen, where he is just sitting down at table for dinner with his wife, and his wife is bringing out increasingly disgusting things and unusual things for him to eat. And he just very politely eats them as he's explaining through things. And his wife is very knowingly doing this to kind of torture him, and even has weird sound effects to go along with it. It's fun. It's not great Hitchcock, but it is very much fun Hitchcock, kind of let loose, saying, you know, I've been experiencing troubles, let's just break loose. And I think it works fairly well. Number 23 is Rope. Now, this is mainly known as Hitchcock's one-shot movie. It's kind of 2 or 3 shots. I think there's 2 or 3 cuts, like actual cuts between shots, and not the hidden cuts behind like a cabinet or something. So it's not quite purported to be one shot. It's just 2 or 3 very long takes. You know, kind of with hidden cuts inside. That being said, it's an experiment. It's the fullest expression of the experiment that he had actually really been starting for a while. The biggest version of this beforehand were a couple of individual sequences in his movie Under Capricorn. And I think the embrace here kind of undermines what Hitchcock did. You know, his power was in editing. You know, it was creating sequences through editing. And essentially filming a play robs cinema of some of its key ingredients, its key tools, in order to create tension, which is what he was trying to do. And so you end up with a largely tensionless affair, but it's all like, it's actually about something interesting. So it's about 2 friends who murder one of their friends for no reason, because they see it as the fulfillment of the ideas of one of their professors, played by Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart ends up being confronted with the idea that he essentially advocated for murder. And it's essentially what he had been doing, you know, and he ends up having this thing later where he ends up saying that he, you know, valued things that sounded good rather than actually meant good, and never really thought about what he said. So it's kind of this implication of fighting style over substance. And it's interesting. It's really interesting watching Jimmy Stewart kind of face what he had created. Stewart would later say he felt like he was miscast, but I really don't agree. I think he's actually quite good. You know, he's kind of a guy who just kind of says stuff and never really thinks about it. I assume he felt like the character needed someone with a bit more of a mean demeanor, perhaps. Someone who would be a bit more obviously okay with murder, but I think him acting as this kind of like milquetoast academic who was just like, oh sure, murder's fine, is kind of perfect. You know, it's the banality of evil sort of thing. But ultimately the film is kind of undone by the fact that it is these long takes that deny Hitchcock a lot of the tools he needed in order to create tension within individual sequences. So individual sequences just end up feeling flatter than they normally would, which is frustrating. It's not a bad film. It's an interesting film. It's got some bit of tension. You know, it's like the kind of tension you would experience while watching a stage play, but ultimately, you know, it kind of needed more. Number 22 is The Farmer's Wife. This is one of Hitchcock's silent films, and it's a small delight. It is a romantic comedy about Farmer Sweetland, who marries off his daughter and decides that it's time for him to remarry after years of widowhood. And You know what? He's got a very obvious choice in his maid. His maid is obviously adores him, but he's not going to consider her, and he goes off and he proposes to 4 other women. And all 4 interactions, well, the first 3 interactions are actually really, really funny. It's just he walks up to someone, he proposes, and they give a reason, and then he just ends up insulting them. And it's actually surprisingly fun. The 4th is just extra. Most of it is actually cut out. We kind of see the beginning and we see the end, and I wonder if they realized in editing it was kind of one too much. It is kind of a long silent film. It's almost a full 2 hours, and so you just kind of wonder is an extra like 5 minutes there just been cut out because it was just you have the rule of 3s in terms of comedy, and then you have this 4th one. It's just like we could probably excise that. But it obviously ends up where we always knew it was going to end up, with him discovering that he doesn't want an independent woman. He wants the dependent woman who will just take his jacket as he's proposing to her. It was made in 1928. But it is just this delightful little film, and it's surprisingly entertaining from beginning to end, and it very much is a lost gem. Well, not lost, you can find it. And I think, for those of you who are open to, silent films, it is a small gem worthy of discovery. Number 21 is The Lady Vanishes. And this is one, well, I like the film. I think it's good, but the way people talk about it feels like it's like top tier Hitchcock, and I've just never felt it. I've seen it 3 times, and every single time I watch it, I'm like, that's a nice little adventure. And that's kind of it. I'm not entirely sure why there's this huge disconnect between my opinion and seemingly everyone else's, but let's just put it aside. I really do like the film. I think it's fun. It's the story of the disappearance of Miss Froy, a little old lady who vanishes off a train after our central character is hit on the head, and then no one can remember her. So what happened to her? So she joins with a fellow passenger, and they start investigating, and they discover a plot dealing with, spies and stuff. And it's fun. It's fun. It doesn't have like a sort of grand sweep. It doesn't have a sort of like grand sense of adventure, and it doesn't have any sort of like thematic depth. It's just a fun little adventure about searching for a little old lady who's lost. And you know what? Hitchcock manages the set extremely well. The film is never boring to look at. This is a Hitchcock film. Those are precious and few and far between that are not interesting to look at, and he does it very well here. It's fun. I enjoy it. But that's kind of all it is. It's not great cinema, but it's fun. Number 20 is Downhill. This is another one of Hitchcock's silent films, and it's surprisingly solid. I said while talking about Easy Virtue that it's something of a companion piece to this, about a young person who is accused of something they didn't do and has to deal with the fallout afterwards. And I do think this is the better of the two. I think it's like a fairly solid leap between Easy Virtue and this one. This one came first. It's the story of Roddy, who is the son of a rich man going to a prep school, who decides to have a fun night out on the town with his friend Tim, and they end up with a young girl, and Roddy has nothing to do with her. Tim ends up having sex with her. It's implied, of course, this is pre-Hays Code, but it's also Breton. And the girl ends up accusing Roddy of prostitution and being the father of her child, and Roddy refuses to give Tim up. He's loyal to his friend, so he just accepts the blame. He's rich, Tim is not. Tim's life would be destroyed if they found out, and so Roddy decides to take it on himself to take the blame, but Roddy's own father won't believe him. His father just believes in the worst in him, and so Roddy ends up leaving. And he ends up a series of odd jobs. He ends up like in a small dance hall in southern France where he dances for old ladies. There's wonderful filmmaking throughout. I'm just suddenly thinking of it now because once the light comes into the dance hall, we see like the terrible condition that he's in. But he also has a job as like an actor, and then he gets sent home when people think they can like get some sort of reward for him. And on the ship home, which takes like 5 days, it's just these wonderful surrealistic images as he has like nightmares and visions and stuff. And it's really, really good. Like the first like hour and 40 minutes of this movie is really good. And then the final 10 minutes just feels like an easy sop to an easy ending where all is forgiven and everything. And to make matters worse, we never see Tim again. I really feel like we needed to see Tim at some point. You know, it's just, Tim is kind of the orchestrator of Roddy's downfall, and we never see him again. I do think he needed to reappear later in some form. But that being said, the movie is actually quite good. It's silent, so it's going to limit its appeal to people, but it is a really surprisingly solid little, you know, silent drama with a lot of wonderful visual stuff from Hitchcock. Number 19 is The Lodger. This is the silent film that Hitchcock is known for. And it makes sense. It is very much a precursor to the sort of filmmaker he would become. You know, it deals with death, it deals with, you know, mistaken identity, it deals with the wrong man. And you know what? It works quite well. This is Hitchcock deciding very early he's going to make a German expressionistic film, and it fully is that. He had huge German expressionistic influences, what they were doing in Germany, well, some of what they were doing in Germany really influenced him in the 20s. And he kind of pushes it to as much as he can. And it's the actual story is fairly compelling. You know, it's piling on the evidence to a particular character who's responsible for all the murders, which means it's probably not him. But I think the ending actually kind of leaves things a bit more open than possible. You know, whenever we see something actually dramatized in film, we tend to indicate that, oh, you know, it happened that way. But when it's flashback from someone's point of view, there's always this implication, potential implication, that what we're seeing isn't actually true. And Hitchcock actually did play with things with point of view later in his career. So it's like, is he doing that here? I'm not sure. But ultimately, the film is more of a stylistic flex on his part than anything else. And within that context, it's actually really fun. You know, it's completely understandable why this is kind of like the only silent film that Hitchcock made that people know him for, because it does fit everything else. But ultimately, it's like it's fun. You know, it's not just that he's known for this sort of thing. It's like it is a fun silent film. Number 18 is Strangers on a Train. I really like this film. You know, the central conceit of, you know, kind of a deranged young man deciding to exchange murders with a tennis hero he meets on a train who has his own personal problems and a person he wants to get rid of is really fun. You know, it's the sort of thing that you can just imagine Hitchcock kind of like pulling together with his wife or his friends at a dinner party saying, oh, what if this, what if this, what if this? And it manifests like really, really well. I just have a couple small problems with it. The first starts in the beginning. When Guy and Bruno first meet, I don't think Guy would have tolerated the interaction. Bruno is too weird and too unhinged too early, and Guy is too famous. And he's like, he probably doesn't need to deal with weird fans. It's like, I thank you for your attention. I'm gonna go to my room. Which just, it's like, okay. The other is late. Bruno is at you know, he's a rich heir, and he's at a party of the elite in DC, and he play acts strangling an older woman. You know, it's apparently something Hitchcock liked to do at parties. And Bruno kind of loses control and ends up actually nearly choking her, and then he just gets let go. And it feels wrong. You know, it's like, you know, no police are called, no suspicion is aroused against him. It's just all of a sudden, oh, that's just Bruno. Bruno just apparently likes to accidentally strangle older women, and that's fine. I mean, you know, if you're gonna sell like the entire edifice of the elite as like deeply corrupt and amoral, that would be one thing, but that's not what Hitchcock does here. It's just everyone just seems kind of nice, and then suddenly there's Bruno. But outside of that, it's like, you know, there's so much that Hitchcock gets to just flex with in terms of individual sequences, in terms of the actual mystery. Oh, there's no real mystery. In terms of the suspenseful series of events, as Guy has to undo what happened, or not undo, but just kind of like prevent Bruno from causing any further damage. It's like, it's very, very solid stuff, and I really, really enjoy it. I kind of wish the beginning, I wish Bruno had been more normal in that early interaction, because the performance by Robert Walker is just deeply compelling all over the place. And, you know, I would have wanted to trust him earlier to have a more kind of subdued performance to get himself under Guy's wing just a little bit. But otherwise, the movie's really quite good. Number 17 is Sabotage. Now, this is one of those films that's really designed to be topical. It's, you know, about a bit of sabotage that happens at a wartime factory, and the wrong man, Barry Keane, being blamed for it. And then he has to go on a cross-country adventure, picking up a pretty woman along the way named Pat, and he has to clear his name. And you know what? It's really fun. The moving of our characters from one place to the next is very solidly built. Individual sequences are very fun. I just have these small issues with, first of all, there is some moralizing done in terms of dialogue. I'm not opposed to films having morals. I am opposed to films stopping drama to have speeches that are kind of unrelated to the drama. And that's what happens here. And it's very like, we're in the middle of World War II and we need to pull together and all this stuff. And it's like, can we move on with the actual story, please? The other thing is the actual guy who did it is a guy named Fry. We see him early in the film. We kind of completely forget about him for an hour, and then he shows up late. And when I saw him, I didn't recognize him. It had been so long, and the guy who plays him is so nondescript that it's just like, oh, I need to be actively reminded that this is the guy we're looking for. You know, it's, you know, you remember when I was talking about Young and Innocent, there, you know, we kind of forget the mystery for an hour, and we have this charming interlude where people fall in love, and that's essentially what happens here. We just, you know, do it as well on top of like some individual suspense sequences that actually function very, very well. And, you know, the meat of it ends up being this relationship that develops between Barry and Pat, and it's quite endearing. The guy who plays Barry is not as, you know, effortlessly charming as someone like Robert Donat, who, you know, plays the central character in the 39 Steps. But ultimately, Robert Cummins is fine in the role. He's not great, but he works well enough within the space. And, you know, the film is an entertaining little wartime adventure. And you know what? It works. I just have some niggling issues, that's all. Number 16 is To Catch a Thief. You know, sometimes a man just needs a vacation. And that's exactly what this movie represents. It is Alfred Hitchcock going on vacation with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly to the south of France and just happening to make a movie at the same time. It is a light, frothy affair full of style and very little substance. And you know what? I get a complete kick out of it. It is the story of Cary Grant, who is a thief who gets falsely accused of stealing something in particular, and the romance that develops between him and Grace Kelly. And Grace Kelly is just looking for some more excitement, and Cary Grant's, you know, thief just kind of represents what she's looking for. And, you know, individual sequences are like solid and fun. Could this have been like the tighter, more suspenseful movie that Hitchcock was generally known for? Yes, it could have been, but I think it probably would have lost some of its charm. And you know what? As I said, sometimes a man just needs a vacation. And, you know, the story as it progresses, you know, it makes sense. It's really completely relying on the charm of its actors. And that's really where, you know, I'm not a big fan of the idea of the movie star, but then you watch something like this and you're like, I see why people like really get invested in some of these people, because Cary Grant's easy charm is just so easy to pick up. It's like, yes, it's like, I want to watch him. That's not entirely what a movie star is supposed to be, but that's another thing. Really, the film is just a fun, light, and frothy adventure, and I really do enjoy it. It's bright, it's colorful, it's, again, an excuse to make it a movie while on vacation. You know, vacation in a movie very rarely works out like this. You think of something like Donovan's Reef by John Ford, which is not a disaster, but is not like good. And then you think of this, and it's just like, it's just easy, charming, and fun. It's like, yeah. He can have this. Number 15 is The Trouble with Harry. This movie is endearingly sweet and deeply blackly comic, and it's right up my alley. It's the story of the discovery of a dead body in a quiet northeastern town, and how everyone needs to bury, unbury, rebury, unrebury, and re-rebury him again, and then unre-rebury him. Because people keep blaming themselves for his death and don't know how to kind of move forward. And it's really just becomes this clothesline on which to hang a bunch of little dramas as people kind of learn to connect over the course of the events of the film. And it's really sweetly endearing. You know, you got the older couple who decide, hey, we're gonna we can say hello to each other and pursue a romance now. We've got the younger couple who decide, oh, let me introduce myself over the course of dealing with this dead body. And it's really fun. There's also some like outright funny stuff dealing with people like expecting to find the body someplace and not finding it, or not expecting it and finding it. And it's really fun. It's really surprisingly heartwarming and endearing, and I really love it. This is one of those movies that actually performed really badly for Hitchcock. The movie he made immediately after this was the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, which is a reaction to a smaller film without any real movie stars. The closest you can say is Shirley MacLaine, and I'm not sure she ever was like a big box office draw on her own. And then, he reacted with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day and a spy adventure. But this is kind of where I love Hitchcock. Just like that darkly comic, sweet man who just like decided to find some sweetness amidst death. And it's endearing, and I really, really like it. Number 14 is Dial M for Murder. If behind the scenes reports are to be believed, this is one of those movies where Alfred Hitchcock was very disengaged during production. He usually was disengaged, but this one in particular is just like, he really didn't care. It was his effort to complete his contract with Warner Brothers and kind of nothing else. It is very kind of straightforwardly adapted from a stage play. And you know what? It's probably the best example of Alfred Hitchcock not really caring about a production and managing to make something out of it. It's the story of Ray Milland, who is married to Grace Kelly. Milland knows that Grace Kelly has been carrying on an affair with another man, and Ray Milland decides to organize her murder. When she doesn't end up dead, things kind of spiral. Where the movie is actually really fun is actually in how it kind of treats expectation and delivery. We get a very detailed outline of what is supposed to happen. It really reminded me of the movie Gambit, starring Michael Caine and Shirley MacLaine. And this one ends up it's in the similar vein where we get this outline of what's supposed to happen and then nothing follows through. Everything is undermined immediately. And it is really entertaining. And on top of what we already have, we also have the performance by the police investigator played by John Williams, who is really, really fun. He just kind of has this knowing sense that is really kind of infectious. And so the film is actually just a surprising success from Hitchcock, considering his lack of care. It's not top tier Hitchcock, but it is quite good. Now, one of the things that kind of sets the movie apart is the fact that it is filmed in 3D, but the 3D only really exists for like one shot of like scissors going forward. Otherwise, it's typical Hitchcock. But it's solid. It's good stuff. Number 13 is The Birds. This movie is all style and no substance. There is no reason for anything to have happened. It is just pure horror on the part of Hitchcock as we watch a small seaside California town descend into chaos and death with a bunch of birds just deciding, hey, we're gonna kill everybody now. It's the story of Tippi Hedren, who plays a woman who goes out to this little seaside town from San Francisco bringing a pet because she just finds the man that she's following to be attractive. Doesn't matter who he is. And, she gets there, she kind of finds a way to, spend a few days, and then chaos erupts. And you know what? It's really fun. Especially the ending kind of existed as a way for Hitchcock to torture Tippi Hedren a bit. You know, you could tell she's obviously very distraught in those scenes when she has birds attached to her. But it is this very fun exploration of style on the part of Hitchcock's part, where it's this very fun exploration of style on Hitchcock's part, where he just sends the entire movie into this like dystopian nightmare by the end. It's, you know, the kind of thinness of everything kind of works against the film a little bit. There's also that, you know, notorious scene late where a woman just walks in and starts explaining birds, which like has no real meaning, which is completely unnecessary. But ultimately the film is just, it's a very fun exploration of Hitchcock just deciding, all right, I'm going to make a movie that's just kind of pure horror out of nothing, and he does it extremely well. Number 12 is the original, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And I kind of love this movie. This is the movie where it really feels like Hitchcock has finally gotten his sound feet under him and he can just make movies again. He doesn't have to worry about really kind of experimenting with the sound technology anymore. He's comfortable enough and he's just going to make movies again. And what he does here is one of his best, you know, British movies. It is, you know, just the Wrong Man. It is a tale of people being roped into spy mechanics, story of a couple vacationing in Switzerland whose child gets kidnapped and they have to work with British intelligence and on their own in order to track down their child who is being held by the evil Peter Lorre. And Peter Lorre is great. This was his first English language role. He was speaking phonetically, apparently, but he's got this wonderful presence. And I really feel like where this film kind of stands above the remake is in particular individual sequences, in particular the Albert Hall sequence, which is fantastic. And also when kind of, there's a late moment where it feels just, it's in both of them, but it's delivered in very different ways, where the mother has the information revealed that, you know, her son is alive and somewhere. In the remake, she's just outright told. In this one, it's just the handing over of a pin that the child had been wearing in the beginning and had been very prominent and established. And suddenly, you know, just seeing that makes her realize. And it's just, it's moments like that where it's just, you know, there's a rougher edge to everything. You know, it's like Hitchcock is a far less assured filmmaker at this than he was in the 50s. But ultimately, I really feel like it's a greater fulfillment of the promise of the story. And, you know, again, that Albert Hall sequence is amazing. So yes, I do think it's superior, and I do think it's one of his best British films, and it is kind of one of his best films. Number 11 is Suspicion. This is probably most famous because the studio, the Hays Code, and everyone required changes to the ending, and Hitchcock made changes to the ending. It's adapted from a novel, so it's not the exact ending of the novel. But you know what? Is it a cop-out? Or is it actually more open-ended than, you know, on first glance? So it's a story of Joan Fontaine who falls in love with Cary Grant. Cary Grant kind of exudes confidence and wealth, and they get married, but then it quickly becomes obvious that Cary Grant is perennially penniless and a bit of a con man. And, you know, her suspicion of him steadily grows over time. It ends up involving a murder. She ends up kind of feeling trapped in her own house. There's that great shot of like the milk that he's carrying up to her up the stairs that's just illuminating. You know, it's like, is there poison in it or is there not? And it's this fantastic and very tight series of events as Joan Fontaine steadily grows suspicious of her own husband, and her husband suddenly, essentially just deserving the suspicion. And so like the ending, is he actually a murderer or not? And, you know, he gives this plea that he's not, and they end up driving away. But is that enough? Is it just his word is good enough? Or did he just talk his way out of a situation again? And I lean towards the latter. I think he probably, I assume in the book he actually does kill Joan Fontaine's character, but in the actual movie, it's still open. It's like he is still perennially penniless. He still could have killed his friend, and you know what? It's still open, and that's kind of where the satisfaction I get out of it. The movie's like really tight and really suspenseful and really fun. It's just it's very high quality Hitchcock. Number 10 is Under Capricorn. Now, I really feel like this is a completely forgotten gem in Hitchcock's career. It is also a victim of expectations. Hitchcock, especially at the time, was already known as a director of thrillers, and the marketing of the film marketed it as a thriller. And it's not. It is a drama. There are some thriller elements late, but ultimately this is really just a character drama about a man with a past. You know, think Jane Eyre type stuff. And I think it works exceptionally, exceptionally well. Anchored by performances from Joseph Cotten, who plays a man with a past that he has to hide, and Ingrid Bergman, his wife. And, you know, she is our point of view character trying to figure out what's going on. And, you know, it's set in the interesting setting of convict era Australia. And you know what? It works really, really well. This is also where Hitchcock's embrace of long takes, which was kind of his raison d'etre for experimentation for several years, kind of reached its technical height. Everyone remembers Rope for it, but Rope is essentially just moving back and forth along a kind of a simple set. This are extremely complex camera moves around complex sets, and they have dramatic purpose. And it works exceptionally, exceptionally well. I think the drama works really well. There is a turn of events, a reveal of certain things that happens late that kind of recasts everything that I think works rather perfectly. This, I really think, is great Hitchcock. It's not typical Hitchcock because it is much more of a straight drama. You know, once we get to a shrunken head by the end, you're like, oh, there it is. But you have to kind of get through like an hour and 40 minutes to get there. And that first hour and 40 minutes is just really good, kind of great drama. And I love it for it. I don't want it to be anything else, and I'm very happy with it as it is. This is a small triumph that everyone seems to have forgotten, that everyone seems to have ignored since its very beginning. And I want to change that. I want more people to discover Under Capricorn and realize it is a gem. Number 9 is The Wrong Man. Now this is really interesting. It's the closest Hitchcock ever got to cinema verite, and it is the story of a real-life man, Manny, played by Henry Fonda, and his wife Vera Mills. Manny gets accused of a crime he didn't commit, and he spends several years trying to clear his name. And it's an outright horror movie. It's like there's no gore, there are no ghosts, but this is just a man completely caught up in a system that he doesn't understand, trying to tell the truth, and no one will listen to him. It's deeply, deeply compelling stuff of a man, of like the titular eponymous wrong man that Hitchcock had been playing with in extravagant adventure-like settings his entire career, suddenly given a very grounded approach, and it works exceptionally well. It is a complete inversion of everything he had been doing, and he does it kind of perfectly. It's interesting too in that Manny is an incredibly passive character. He just kind of sits there and takes the abuse and then just tries to find the next step forward, which I find to be an interesting contrast to my reaction to someone like Montgomery Clift's character in I Confess, where he felt incredibly passive, but in a more obviously dramatic environment, and it felt uncompelling. Here, he's passive because he's caught in something realistic, because he doesn't know what to do, because the system itself is frightening. You know, it's like Hitchcock loved to tell a story of when he was a child, his father took him to the local police station and had them arrest him, and it scarred him for life. And this feels like the full manifestation of that fear, where someone will come along and point at Hitchcock and say, "That's the man who robbed me," even though Hitchcock had done nothing. So it is a magnificent, very low-key example of Hitchcock's talent and his ability to kind of move into different styles. The movie was surprisingly poorly received at the time. The New York Times review was weird, calling it frightening but not dramatic, which is curious because it's like if it was frightening, it seems to have been effective, but it's not following your dramatic rules because it's following something real. But whatever. The movie is very much worthy of discovery. Henry Fonda is always a great actor, and he does very well here. And Hitchcock is just stretching here and really succeeding, even if no one really recognized it at the time. Number 8 is Rear Window. Always make the audience suffer as much as possible. It's hard to imagine a better example of that manifested than Rear Window, where we actually have an audience member as our central character. Jimmy Stewart plays a photographer who is laid up in his apartment for weeks and weeks because he broke his leg getting an incredible shot on a racetrack. And he has become bored, and he just watches the people in his little apartment complex out his back window. His girlfriend, Grace Kelly, brings him meals and is beautiful, and that's kind of her existence. And his maid, played by Thelma Ritter, his nurse, played by Thelma Ritter, who is a wonderful presence, just comes in and chastises him all the time. And while watching out the window, he discovers that a murder might have happened. He doesn't have a full story, but he decides to piece together the clues based on limited information, and he invokes the help of Grace Kelly and Thelma Ritter in order to try to figure out what's going on. And kind of one of the things that I kind of love about the film is that there is this strong surety that he's right, and we never get confirmation of it. Well, I guess we do. At the very, very end of it, we do get confirmation, but it's like its final lines of dialogue, and up to that point, it's like, was he right or not, or was he just terrorizing a guy whose wife went out on vacation? It is a huge stylistic flex on Hitchcock's part. He built a giant set. The sunlight is shockingly convincing, which is kind of a hard thing to do. And it's a story from just a window, and it works incredibly well as this mystery builds over time, but we also get this wonderful sense of life of the entire community, so that when things kind of blow up and we get reactions from people, it feels natural. It is a triumph of a film from his part. It feels so effortless, which is one of the great joys of Hitchcock. It's like, oh yeah, I can just make this little movie and it's just going to be great. Hitchcock was really something to admire. Number 7 is Rebecca. This is the movie that welcomed Hitchcock to Hollywood. He worked for David O. Selznick, and you kind of get the sense that Hitchcock was there to fulfill Selznick's dreams. That Hitchcock just kind of did everything Selznick wanted. Not because of any sort of stylistic things, but it's just because of how demanding and controlling Selznick was. You kind of get the sense that Hitchcock, having survived the entire production as just the only director, managed the relationship well, and managing the relationship with Selznick largely meant doing what he said. And so what we end up having is this adaptation of the Daphne du Maurier novel that is extremely handsome, brought upon by, Selznick's money and Hitchcock's talent, that really kind of brings everything to life. This is a small triumph of adaptation and film. Taking the new Mrs. De Winter as she makes her way to Manderley, as she is introduced to Mrs. Danvers, as she tries to create a life with her husband, Mr. De Winter, and everything just is nothing is what it seems. I have just the smallest of issues with the last 15 minutes or so. It's tiny. Everything that happens in those 15 minutes has been laid out and it follows through, but it's just Hitchcock was so good at selling the sort of gothic ghost story through the rest of the film, then when we get to the actual explanation of the events that we've been partaking in, it ends up feeling a little more mundane than what had been stylistically promised. So again, the stuff follows, it makes sense, and it works. It's like there's a stylistic break between what we had been seeing and what is finally delivered that is just, it leaves me the tiniest bit cold. Still, overall, the film is just this great romantic romance, this great gothic romance of a woman kind of uncovering hidden pasts and everything, and it's wonderful to watch. I kind of wish it was an actual ghost story. I guess that's it. Number 6 is North by Northwest. Now, when Ernest Lehman set out to write this film for Hitchcock, he set out on a mission to make the ultimate Hitchcock movie, and I think he succeeded. It is not my favorite Hitchcock movie, but if you had to pick one movie that kind of exemplified most of his filmography, it would be North by Northwest. It's the wrong man, it's the spy adventure, it's the MacGuffin that doesn't matter at all, it's the blonde, it's everything. And it works wonderfully, wonderfully well. It is just this grand adventure of Cary Grant playing the wrong man, brought into a spy mystery and being manipulated on every side as he falls in love with the blonde, played by Eva Marie Saint, as he's pursuing the bad guy, played by James Mason. And he has to get himself into and out of different little scrapes, and he uses his charm, he uses, any tool he has to get in and out of them. And it is just wonderfully entertaining with amazing suspense-based sequences dotted throughout. Of course, it ends on top of Mount Rushmore, which is just this wonderful vision of a sequence, and Hitchcock is just flexing. This is the movie he made after Vertigo, which was a critical and financial disappointment. So you always keep getting this sense from Hitchcock that he's reacting to his own failures when he makes a movie like this, reminding me of The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake made after the failure of The Trouble with Harry. And it's just like, all right, fine, you don't like that? Well, I'll make something else. I'll make that one thing that you keep wanting me to make. And it just keeps working. And he was just very, very good at it. And the script by Lehman is just everything that he needs, and it's just a marvelously entertaining film from beginning to end, and I don't think you need me to tell you that. Number 5 is The 39 Steps. This is the absolute height of Hitchcock's British career, and it is a marvelous adventure, very much in the vein of North by Northwest. This is the movie he made immediately after The Man Who Knew Too Much. I feel like The Man Who Knew Too Much is where Hitchcock finally really felt comfortable in the sound era. And The 39 Steps just exceeds that in every way. It's another spy adventure, another adventure of, a wrong man kind of getting into some sort of spy adventure, this time centered around Robert Dunant's character, who has to figure out the mystery that is hidden by Mr. Memory. And then, he picks up his blonde along the way, played by Madeleine Carroll. And it is just this charming, swift little adventure through the Scottish countryside and down to London, and it's just, as Robert Dunant has to use his charm and his wit to get into and out of situations, much like Cary Grant does later in North by Northwest. It is just, Hitchcock essentially flexing at this point, saying, all right, I've settled into this new sound era, and now I'm just going to deliver a rollickingly fun adventure. And he does it with such abandon and such skill. It is immensely entertaining, and I absolutely love every minute of it. And it's shockingly short, at only 85 minutes. And it just powers through and works remarkably well. It is a triumph of the British era for Hitchcock, and it was surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, it was the most expensive British picture at the time at a grand £60,000 sterling. And you know what? He uses that budget incredibly well. The movie looks fantastic from beginning to end, and it's a rollickingly good adventure from beginning to end. It is a magnificent adventure, and I love it. Number 4 is Psycho. This is Hitchcock at the absolute height of his ability to experiment, to mess with an audience, and to just deliver a fun time at the movies. It's obviously based on the novel. This is a complete effort to just mess with audience expectations. Obviously, very famously, Janet Leigh dies at the 30-minute mark. So, your central main movie star on the poster is suddenly gone at the end of the first act. And that kind of leads into what Hitchcock wanted to do overall with his films. He wanted to kind of set up expectations and then tear them away as he tortured his audience and delivered entertainment. And so, it's obviously the story of Janet Leigh's character who steals $40,000 and runs off, and she ends up at Norman Bates's Bates Motel. And, just as she decides that she's going to return the money and go home and face the consequences, she gets murdered because of Norman Bates. And then it's, so that's, the first half hour. And then after that is the investigation into him. And, this feels like the kind of movie where everyone's like, the first half hour is great, but then after that, things just kind of die down. And it's obviously not the case, because the actual investigation into what's going on ends up so compelling on a suspense level, because we have these bits of information that are hidden from us, and it never feels artificial. It never feels like it's just, the author holding back information that people already know, because Norman Bates himself doesn't know. So Norman Bates can't just be like, oh, well, Mother is actually just a corpse and I'm putting on her dress, because he doesn't realize himself. And so it gives him this space where he can still create these marvelous senses of tension while misleading us. It's this perfect balance of being able to, mislead us, but doing it honestly. And I think that's wonderful. And on top of that, we have these magnificent sequences. Obviously the shower, the killing of the detective at the top of the stairs. It's a lot of just great stuff rolled into one. And it was an experiment. He just pulled crew from his Alfred Hitchcock hour, and he made a movie with them on the cheap. He was like, I can probably make a movie, and it doesn't it can be with television level, sets and crew and everything, but it can still work. And it's kind of, very forward thinking at the time, where, productions would have to get smaller, where, the grand scale of Hollywood productions was going to fall away to smaller independent cinema. So it's like, him striking out and doing that. And apparently he used his own money to do it. And it's like, it's just a wonderful, full-on experiment that just works wonderfully well, and I love it. Number 3 is Shadow of a Doubt. This was reportedly Hitchcock's favorite movie of his own, and I completely see it. This is a marvelous bit of suspense and tension, and I love it. It's the story of young Charlie, played by Teresa Wright, who is wonderfully excited at the arrival of her uncle Charlie, played by Joseph Cotten. There is an idolizing about her uncle that gets completely unraveled. And one of the wonderful sources of horror, and just kind of in general, is taking something that should feel safe and twisting it. And what this is doing is it's taking the hero, the child hero, and discovering that they're human. So that's kind of a normal thing, but in this instance, not only is he human, he's actually a monster. He's a killer, and she has to confront that. And it's you have all of this wonderful interplay between the two characters early, where the idolization is still alive, and we watch it steadily degrade over time as young Charlie figures out who her uncle is. And that gets marvelously contrasted with things like, her father and his neighbor, just kind of not taking murder seriously and describing how they would murder each other and get away with it, which steadily erodes young Charlie's own sense of sanity, because she's dealing with real death at the same time. So it's the uncovering of like the seedy underbelly of real life. And it's this marvelously effective growing up tale that is chaste on the one hand, but deeply, deeply like vulgar on the other, and it kind of exemplifies everything that Hitchcock was really great at. The sequences are fantastic. I love the sight of that train coming in with the thick black smoke billowing out, just harboring, just presaging danger that's coming with that is Uncle Charlie. And the actual little bits of chases and everything, it works so marvelously well. This is really Hitchcock at the height of his powers, and he was so good at all this stuff. And it's a marvelous film, but but it's not like a spy adventure. It's like a domestic thing, and it works marvelously. And I completely see why it's Hitchcock's favorite of his own. I prefer a couple more, but it totally makes sense. This movie's great. Number 2 is Vertigo. Vertigo has seen a small backlash recently, probably because the BFI putting it at the top of the list in 2012. Anything the BFI puts at the top of the list ends up getting a backlash. But I still love this. This is kind of that dreamy, romantic thing that Hitchcock obviously had a great affinity for. He wasn't just a one-man show. He had different little lanes that he liked to pursue. And I think this is the height of his romanticism. It's, obviously the story of Jimmy Stewart, who gets paid to investigate the wife of a rich man. And the wife is played by Kim Novak. And she, decides that, she's going to kill herself. And she's obsessed with, she thinks she's living a past life or something. And Jimmy Stewart becomes obsessed with her until she ends up dead. And then, he continues his obsession, picking up a girl who looks like her and kind of making her in that image. And it's all sick and twisted, but handled in this wonderfully romantic way, which is, the movie never actually loses sight of the fact that it is kind of sick and twisted. Everything about it is sick and twisted. Jimmy Stewart's obsessed with the student that he's turning into, the wife, the student's involvement in the plot in the beginning, the fact that, a murderer kind of goes unpunished. There is a deleted ending of Scotty listening to a radio broadcast that says that the murderer was brought to justice, but ultimately it's not in the final movie. It's because the movie is centrally focused on a man completely losing himself to a fantasy. And it's marvelous in that way. Just, kind of how he gets drawn into this and he can never let go. He becomes obsessed. And I think it's marvelously done. Obviously, it was a poorly received film at the time. I think it's mentioned like twice in the entire interview with Francois Truffaut. So, Hitchcock himself was largely dismissive of it afterwards, in no small part because of its financial failure. But I really think it is a truly wonderful film. It has this, mature approach to fantasy that I think works exceptionally well. And, the wonderful use of color throughout. It all reminds me of like places that Guillermo del Toro would end up going later. And it's a really, really wonderful film. And I do get caught up in it every single time. Number 1 is Notorious. Having rewatched all of Hitchcock's films a couple of times, I keep expecting something else to kind of overpower Notorious, and it just never happens. Notorious has long been my favorite Hitchcock film, and you know what? It continues to be. I absolutely loved it. It is, the story of Cary Grant, who is a government agent who recruits Ingrid Bergman, the daughter of a Nazi scientist, to get close to Claude Rains's Nazi character in South America. And, it's the story of using a woman, the woman kind of like finding her own feet, but, the grand romance of, two people who, obviously desire each other, but who cannot in the reality of the movie actually be together, and they have to watch themselves tear themselves apart and bring themselves back together. And Ingrid Bergman ends up, kind of caught between two men. It's like between, the kind of awful but very charming and wonderful Cary Grant, the American agent, and then the surprisingly like innocent and puppyish Nazi, who is part of a plot to like get some sort of nuclear power into Nazi hands. So it's like it's this wonderfully complex romance that works magnificently well, and I absolutely love it. The actors are performing at the top of their game. Cary Grant is wonderfully charming, but alternating that between like really like skeevy. Ingrid Bergman just has this flip between, kind of like self-assured, but also incredibly innocent. And then, the real star, I think, is Claude Rains, who is kind of ends up caught in a trap that of his own making, and he has no way out. And it's full of these marvelous sequences, like around a little coffee cup, around stairs. It's an absolute full package of Alfred Hitchcock's abilities, and I absolutely love it. It is easily my favorite Hitchcock film, and it has been for a while. So that's it. That is the master of suspense. That is all 53 of his surviving films, ranked definitively. I love Hitchcock. He was an incredible, distinctive talent. He had a wonderful experimental streak that he liked to pursue, but he kept having to flip back and forth between appeasing his audience and kind of pursuing his own directions from here to there. And it just creates this fascinating and surprisingly complex filmography over the course of decades, where he made a wide variety of films and he was wildly successful in a wide variety of them. Not everything is great. He had his moments where he faltered, but ultimately, overall, the man was incredibly, incredibly talented, bringing his German expressionistic influences, bringing his own personal fears, bringing his own personal kinks, shall we say, to the screen and making them wildly entertaining for the world at large. So that's Hitchcock. He was really good at this whole movie making thing.